We are studying Sri Aurobindo's description of evolution and our place in it. In this chapter of the Life Divine, titled Man and the Evolution, we will see all the fundamental principles, all the possible variations of these principles which drive the movement of evolution, not only on our earth, but in all of creation, across all the planets in the universe. He goes into first principles, the most fundamental, essential objectives and methods of nature. We have only read the first paragraph so far, where he has described how, in the first step, so that evolution is possible, there is the concealment of the divine reality by involution into a dense material inconscience, a veil of matter which is insensible, which hides all that divine reality which is within it. The process of emergence therefore becomes, as he described in the passage we read last time, the secret consciousness comes out of its thick and tenebrous prison, but she, that is this vast occult intelligence which is working behind the appearance of complete darkness and inconscience, she delivers it slowly, little by little, in minute infinitesimal drops, in thin jets, in small vibrant concretions of energy and substance, of life, of mind. And we saw last time how this accurately describes even the physical form, but also the tendencies of the process emerging. If you were surrounded by thick darkness, opposing and resisting everything, and you were consciousness trying to wake up, what would be the only way to do? The first step would be to build a tiny as possible point of separation from the darkness. So, minute, infinitesimal drop. And it's a drop because it has to equally oppose in all directions the heaviness and darkness of matter. So it takes the form which is almost spherical. You will see all the early structures of matter, of life, and even the tendencies of mind take on that. And then from there, once you have developed the capacity to resist the darkness, you push forward a jet. It's like a fortress. And from the fortress, the army cuts through, using this as a base. And so that takes the second form of thin jets, again, as thin as necessary, to be able to cut through the opposition. And when you can have several points and several thin jets, they join together, start collaborating to create as if an area of resistance, which is now organized in a more complex and collective structure. That is what he describes as the third step, in small, vibrant concretions of energy and substance. Now, we saw last time how this applies across all the levels of evolution. But it will also apply in our emergence in a higher consciousness against the, less dark, but still cloudy opposition and resistance of human mind, human inertia, the circumstances of the world, where it seems as if everything is somehow trying to pull you back or dissolve or break any emergence of light. And so you will see strategically it is necessary to form a focus first. From that first focus, jets, 1, 2, 3, 4, many eventually, perhaps some of them reaching out to spawn off new focal points until they can all form a group together to form a larger resisting base. And you saw individuality here was so important, but the same principle would exist in a collective effort. If you look back at the structure of the work when Sri Aurobindo withdrew from public political life, he was given the assignment to now develop the new consciousness and prepare its manifestation on earth. The first requirement was for him to withdraw to Pondicherry and withdraw completely, cutting off all contacts from his political work. And so many people were disappointed. Then he is here alone, maybe surrounded with a few people who are not really helping, but forming his center. Once that center develops, it extends in those tiny jets to support now through the people around him who are open to form other small nuclei, and bit by bit developing a framework, a collective framework around him, the mother joining in soon after, to create vibrant concretion of a new consciousness. From there, jets emerging to go further out, as you can see today, in many centers all over the world eventually, where similar efforts begin to grow. And when you think about it, the strategy which is described here of any emergence of consciousness even continues for higher and higher levels of consciousness. The extent of the darkness may be not as dramatic as the dullness of matter out of which life and mind have to emerge, but still, this is the most essential strategy. And then the medium itself in which all this is happening, matter, is not only dull, but it is reluctant. It does not want. It gives resistance and even actively opposes. And then he describes how out of that struggle, the mentality emerges and came last to the human being as he is today. The thinking animal who develops into the reasoning mental being, but carries along with him, even at his highest elevation, the mold of original animality. The dead weight of subconscious of body, the downward pull of gravitation towards the original inertia and nations. And this much we saw. And one more thing he adds, the control of an inconscient material nature over his conscious evolution. It's as if even as we struggle in our effort of consciousness to emerge, to draw out and expand our mental powers, and eventually even still higher spiritual consciousness, there is continued not only this weight of an inertia that pulls, but the control of an inconscient material nature over his conscious evolution. It's as if nature can say, all right, you're going too fast, here's my control to throw at you a resistance, pull you back, somehow trap you, trip you somewhere where you were not conscious, catch a weak point which is not awakened and exaggerate a difficulty. The sense one gets is an active opposition, even an organized opposition of this resistance, which he describes. And we understand why, especially in the early days of the ashram, there were such strict rules to prevent any entry of influences from outside, in order to be able to hold most completely the fortress of protection, to protect that which was being built until it was strong enough and stable enough to be able to face the full onslaught. And then this inconscient material nature, its power for limitation, its law of difficult development. Not only it can somehow limit anything, but it as if demands by a law that your development should be difficult. Its immense force for retardation and frustration. The image of this is given in the Veda as a gigantic dragon. And Sri Aurobindo uses the same phrase in Savitri, where he describes the inconscience as a giant dragon, and even though it withdraws, it's just a single whip of its tail is enough to just shatter all kinds of wonderful things which may have built up. So immense force of retardation and frustration. Now, against this, obviously, the emerging mind is insufficient. Your own personal consciousness is not strong enough. A collective space organized would, of course, be a little more effective. But unless there is a much greater power than the mind, which can enter the mind and even enter the body and face that opposition of inconscience and itself protect against that, the rapid evolution would not be possible. Therefore, the initial focus of the yoga from Sri Aurobindo's and the mother's effort was to bring down as soon as possible into their own body, and to the extent the community was able to hold, the supramental consciousness, or whatever power closest to it that could be brought down, to establish and stabilize it. In fact, in the very first significant step, which is in 1926, they brought down what Sri Aurobindo referred to as the overmental, which is the borderline where mind meets the supramental consciousness, and that being established all the way into the physical body would prepare the way for the supramental now to be able to enter the body and transform even matter. But this establishing of the overmental consciousness into the human body is something of such a great significance that Sri Aurobindo even referred to it as the day of Siddhi. That established, the rest is assured, and only a question of time. This control by the original inconscience over the consciousness emerging from it takes the general shape of a mentality struggling towards knowledge, but itself in what seems to be its fundamental nature, an ignorance. So the sum total of this resistance is that while our mind is struggling to rise towards knowledge, it seems as if its very base is ignorance. Ignorance striving to knowledge. Obviously, it seems to be almost a dichotomy, a gap which could never be fully filled. Thus hampered and burdened, mental man has still to evolve out of himself. Now, with all this burden, which seems almost impossible to overcome, he is describing the work to be done now beyond. Mental man has to evolve out of himself the fully conscious being, a divine manhood, or a spiritual and supramental supermanhood, which shall be the next product of the evolution. It's very interesting. He's describing, well, in three different terms, suggesting even three distinct stages. But what that would lead to in the third final step will, he says, not will be, shall be the next product of the evolution. The word shall in legal terms is an absolute declaration. If you say something will happen, well, the will can be conditional. But shall is unconditional. There's no doubt, nothing can ever negate that. The logic for that, of course, which he has presented elsewhere, is all this, including the resistance of the inconscience, originates itself in the action of the supermind, which creates the world and even creates matter. So, if supermind exists there, and if it is working and entering into evolution, it shall succeed, it shall overcome, and it's only a question of time. So the shall is very certain. But in between, through all this hampered condition, 3 degrees of emergence of something greater than mentality even. First, the fully conscious being. What are we right now? We are semi-conscious, half-conscious, even semi-unconscious, more likely. The conscious part of us is a very tiny little tip on the tip of the iceberg. The rest of it is all semi-conscious or even unconscious. This tip of the mind, which feels as if it is conscious, is not fully conscious. It's conscious of the most surface part of itself. It is not conscious even of its own processes. So your mind thinks of something, but it's not conscious how it thought or what happened in the thinking process. You're asked to create a beautiful image, sketch, painting of something which you have never seen before. It's an interesting challenge. How do you create something you've never seen before? It's easy to imitate what you've seen. And when you start thinking about it, you begin to eliminate all the things which pop up, which are similar to what you've seen before. But at some point, it's as if you start doing something and you come up with something. Where did that something come from if it was not from within your own memory or subconscious influences from outside? What part of your mind actually conceived, created something which you have never seen before? You're not conscious. It just came forward and it took a form and you did it. And so even in its own awareness, it is not conscious. That tip is not conscious. So mind is not fully conscious of itself. Being is certainly not conscious. And the little that mind is conscious of is so superficial. Behind it are entire regions of mind awareness which are not available to it. What he is asking here, evolve out of himself the fully conscious being. That means the mind becomes fully conscious of all of its possibilities, and depending on how you see being here, it can be a fully mental being which is fully conscious, or maybe extending further to some part of the life aspect also. Maybe separated in its full consciousness from the body to some degree. But even attaining to that would be something extraordinary. It would be a mental, fully conscious being. But out of that, a divine manhood. Can this now grow further to acquire the character of divinity instead of just mind? And then go even further, or a spiritual and supramental supermanhood. And at that point, it's as if you break out of the ranges which would be called humanity and go into some super or supra humanity. Think of an ape as an analogy. The ape consciousness, which is already quite crude, if it could come into its full apeness and its full potential, would be very close to the human. And perhaps the only thing missing would be the body's support for vocalization of speech. But in terms of its internal awareness and processing of knowledge and communication of experience, it would be extremely sophisticated like a human being. But from there to the human still feels like a giant step in quality of consciousness, in ability to contain that consciousness in the body and express it in the body. The ape tendencies of wanting to grab, to scratch itself, jump around instinctively, even with a fully conscious mind, all of those would have to go away. But there is a distinct step, as if. And in the same way, the human mind coming into its own as a fully conscious mind being, from there to acquire some character of divinity. One can still conceive of partial divinity, but then to step out of it fully into a consciousness which is entirely spiritual or supramental, that would be a giant leap further. And all this is still to happen from where we are with all the difficulties of the struggle of emerging. That transition, when we get into this supramental supermanhood, the next product of evolution, very distinctly no more human, and so a new species altogether, a new step of consciousness. That transition will mark the passage from the evolution in the ignorance to a greater evolution in the knowledge. Ignorance I capital, knowledge K capital. Founded and proceeding in the light of the superconscient and no longer in the darkness of the ignorance and inconscience. So the main difference between this even improved human mental being, conscious being, perhaps even partially divine manhood, would still be manhood, meaning it is rooted in inconscience and dependent on inconscience. From there, the great leap of spiritual or supramental supermanhood would be rooted in knowledge above. So the distinction, the thing which would distinguish these two stages is where is the root of your identity. In the divine manhood, you're still human, and the root being in the ignorance below. In the supramental consciousness, the roots are in the revealed knowledge, K capital again, which is your definition, your identity, and your primary power of evolution. Now look at capital I, ignorance, and capital K, knowledge, from other discussions we've had before. Sri Aurobindo uses this in the sense that ignorance is the consciousness which is divided. Fundamentally, it has division. And division taken to its culmination is, of course, complete lack of awareness. Knowledge, in contrast, is the consciousness of unity. And K capital makes it the oneness which can never be divided, which can never be lost. So a species of, or a form of consciousness rooted in the oneness, being fully expressive of that oneness to whatever extent the vehicle of the body will allow, but basing itself in the oneness means you have no taint of ignorance. You have at no point the possibility of error. Even if your body has certain limitations, at least it's there as a support, as a container. So this, he says, this will be a transition marking a passage from the evolution which was from below, founded and proceeding in the light of the superconscient and no longer in the darkness. Thereafter, every step of the evolution will be rooted or emerging and expressing of that, not of this. In between, how are you to make a transition? At what point do you say my roots below are withdrawn and my roots above now are plugged in? Because it is a completely different orientation. If you bring the two together, you will find nothing in common. And so this is a deep problem which Sri Aurobindo discusses in detail in his last few articles, which come in the little booklet, The Supramental Manifestation. We don't touch upon that now. And this was the work that the mother did with her own body, always the question of how the transition is to be made. The point, though, of this paragraph is to describe the nature of the struggle, which at first is essential because the divine consciousness concealed itself in this mask of inconscience, of matter. But the nature of the struggle, however difficult it may be, has a point of transition where evolution takes on a fundamentally different character, top down. No more bound to this struggle. And after that, it is light to greater light only. We are, in terms of the large movement of evolution, somewhere close on the threshold of being able to make such a transition. Close, it may take a couple of 100 years perhaps. But the point being, we have in our humanity the capacity to open to that divine consciousness, to develop our humanity into a divine manhood, and even in our highest parts to be able to live in that highest consciousness. If that much can be done, then one can conceive of how the reversal would be not difficult. But it is within reach, and therefore this discussion becomes so important. Now, Sri Aurobindo is going to describe the mechanism of evolution in an individual as distinct from the collective evolution. And this is going to be for us the key by which this kind of a transition could be made. Remember, our goal is always towards the higher evolution. And if for now, having read this paragraph, it seems as if the struggle against the inconscience is so difficult, so big, keep in mind that there is a different picture to the whole story. That while it is difficult, when the action from above enters and takes up the charge of the transition, it can do much more than we could have. And so we need not be too worried about it, but we must understand this is the case, understand the problem itself. Next paragraph, Sri Aurobindo takes up this description of a double process taking place in evolution, which will give us our first key. This terrestrial evolution this terrestrial evolutionary working of nature from matter to mind and beyond it has a double process. There is an outward visible process of physical evolution with birth as its machinery for each evolved form of body housing its own evolved power of consciousness is maintained and kept in continuity by heredity. This is the outward process. There is at the same time an invisible process of soul evolution with rebirth into ascending grades of form and consciousness as its machinery. Let's look at these two first. The first is of the form. Your body is evolving and its process of evolution is birth. Kept in continuity, the form of the body is kept in continuity by heredity. And every time that there is birth, something of the next form has as if the benefit of being able to draw from the best of the current form and maybe improve upon it a little bit. Now, in the old idea of heredity of modern science, the concept was that the genes are hard programmed code. And like a computer program, if one of the bits gets corrupted, your computer crashes. So if the genetics is affected by a cosmic ray hitting it, it breaks it and the cell recognizes something is wrong and breaks down, or its machinery cannot sustain, it breaks down, or it becomes a sickness, cancerous, etc. But the growing knowledge of genetics has changed this picture completely. The picture we have rather is of the genes being something quite fluid. They have a programming of some kind, but the programming itself seems to change. And more than that, whatever the core genetic structure, its activation is something very fluid and even responsive and dependent on the environment. And this particular interface with the environment is called epigenetics. And what is discovered in the epigenetic field, which is now radically changing our picture of the genes, is that even the food you eat, let's say you've just eaten a fresh apple, and the food gets digested and absorbed into the bloodstream, the genetic content of the apple's cells, the epigenetic content, this part of the genes which interfaces with the working of the cells, that is released into your bloodstream and begins to interact with the epigenetics of your whole body's cells, wherever that blood goes. In some degree, bringing the apple character of genetic influence upon your genes. Not reprogramming them, but certainly influencing their activation and their epigenetic movement. Then we discover our human mental, emotional states also affect the epigenetic imprint to a degree that they are able to influence the transmission of genes. So if in the parents there is a strong tendency for mind to go in a certain direction, that tendency is as if captured by this epigenetic interface, and in the transmission of genes, the epigenetics also carries over with this tendency. And sometimes leading even to genetic mutations, not quite understood how. The mechanism is not understood, but this new habit you have is somehow transferred. On the negative side equally, and these are all experiments done with rats because you have to watch them over several lives or generations of change. If the rats are put under stress, then the progeny is influenced by the stress. Not only they have the stressed tendency, but they even recognize the cause of the stress in their new genetic imprint without being taught by parents, without being exposed originally to the cause of the stress. So what you're seeing is something quite extraordinary. In the physical transmission in births, it's as if what the parents are living in as consciousness and its possibilities actually gets handed over in a large portion. And the mechanism of that is now becoming more and more overtly recognized. And this is what Sri Aurobindo is describing here. There is an outward visible process of physical evolution with birth as its machinery. For each evolved form of body housing its own evolved power of consciousness is maintained and kept in continuity by heredity. Meaning, the body now, if it houses a higher grade of consciousness, the birth that it will give will tend to carry the capacity for a higher grade of consciousness, or even perhaps cause or support a higher grade simply by the transmission of what it has developed now. The other side, the inner, hidden process of evolution is not birth but rebirth. It's a subtle play on the word. Rebirth is a completely different concept. It is migration of the soul across birth. This is birth, this is rebirth. But the similarity of the vocabulary in the English language makes for a certain subtle suggestion. There is at the same time an invisible process of soul evolution as distinct from genetic evolution, with rebirth into ascending grades of form and consciousness as its machinery. So when you take rebirth, what do? You take a form and consciousness which is already a higher grade. And that's the beauty of this possibility. If I was for a while in a dog consciousness body, which could only allow so much development of consciousness and expression of form, in the next birth I can take a body which is more evolved, maybe jump into a human body now. And then suddenly I find that what I had already as a capacity of evolution in my soul's consciousness is now able to express much more freely in this highly conscious and plastic material. The suggestion here is extraordinary. On some level, we can even consider the merging of these two, even by technological intervention. What if you could, by an enhancement of the genes, make possible a body which is more conscious and more plastic, which can house now a much higher grade or larger form of consciousness? Not only you would amplify, speed up the first level of evolution, which is through births of genetics, but even offer to the soul's evolution higher qualities of human bodies for it to take birth and use without having to wait for a slow physical evolution to catch up. The suggestion here is one of the problems of the soul's evolution is lack of sufficient bodies which are conscious enough or which are not damaged too much. I'm going to put this in context of the current phase of human development, where across the world in large numbers there is a tendency to degrade, even damage, the human genome. It takes the form of exaggerated exposure to poisons of various kinds, including plastics and even poisons which are implanted in the body for many decades all over the world, and even today continuing in India. They will implant in teeth mercury-based fillings, knowing that mercury is a neurotoxin and will continue to leach and perhaps even become causes of many other illnesses. And yet, with this, with each generation which is being more poisoned, you are as if weakening, making the body less strong, less healthy. And the soul which is now preparing to come again says, here I'm not getting good enough bodies. At the same time, you are also introducing other damaging influences of culture or even biology through smoking, alcohol, which can further damage the capacity of the body to house a higher grade of consciousness by dulling or damaging the higher parts of the brain we discussed last time. And the soul says, I need a better vehicle. What choice does it have? Well, it has to manage. It gets into this body which is now not so plastic, partly damaged, and has to push its consciousness as if to push forward and overcome those limitations. If in childhood you do not have a healthy upbringing and the psychology is damaged, Imagine the struggle the soul has to go through with a damaged psychology. If you had a healthy upbringing in a safe, secure, joyous, aspiring environment, what a great help it is for the soul. But these are becoming less and less easily accessible in the mass of the tendency. And equally, as if in response to that, we have small families of very conscious parents trying to create, against the general resistance, a positive and uplifting environment. And for a higher, more conscious soul, those are precious centers of light. So we are now seeing two types of evolution. One which is the biology improving, the other is the consciousness hopping through forms which are of higher grade. The first by itself would mean only a cosmic evolution. Now he's going to explore both in separation. And you will see that the two are completely independent of each other. In the first case, you can have purely biological evolution. Forget the soul's evolution. The consciousness now housed in the body keeps improving with improved genetics, improved environmental influences, and so on. You can have an entire species that grows, but the overall consciousness of the species will be dependent on this quality of genetics improving. So it would mean only a cosmic evolution. The group consciousness is what is evolving. You will see this obviously in certain kinds of animals where the individuality is not very strong. Most obviously you can see in ants, in bees, where you have a more collective consciousness. But even in others where there is the group, family or pack which is very strong and the individuality is not so strong, the pack breed quality keeps improving. Separate from this completely can be the individual evolution through rebirth. Suppose now the first improvement of genetics is completely knocked out and it does not take place. But you have a variety of life forms which have evolved. The soul would then migrate from the dog to the ape form, from the ape to a crude human form, from the crude human to perhaps a relatively more evolved human form. But basically looking for vehicles that are capable of housing and expressing something more. But the soul within could continue to evolve, simply jumping across available forms. Somewhere in the universe, in the infinity of the universe, there has to be a form good enough for now for your more evolved consciousness. Or, at the very least, it accepts a hampered, limited form and still continues to grow internally in consciousness. Does not matter. Which is often the case in certain autistic children, for example, where the biology or the nervous system has been damaged in a certain way, and the soul may be very conscious, maybe even evolved, and it may say, all right, but I will still continue to do my work and grow in my way. And externally you will see somebody with extraordinary potentials or capacity of consciousness, but somehow with a damaged ability to express that capacity and things like that. But we look at the first now. The first by itself would mean only a cosmic evolution. For the individual would be a quickly perishing instrument, and the race, a more abiding collective formulation, would be the real step in the progressive manifestation of the cosmic inhabitant, the universal spirit. Let's take an example of rats in the laboratory. A couple of years ago, there was a storm which brought the sea into the New York City, filled not only its sewers but filled the streets and spread into the basement of many buildings, and particularly the basements of research labs of the universities. And a lot of strains of rats died. Either they escaped, got mixed, or they died, simply they drowned. And in the research community, there was a big hullabaloo about it to say, so many decades of work has now been lost. What was the decades of work? they had bred specialized strains of rats in the lab, which had specialized capacities. Now, either they had specialized skills, they had specialized illnesses, they had specialized immunities to illnesses, all kinds of things. So, a rat strain which is now immune to a particular illness through genetic intervention, interbreeding, or a rat strain which had diabetes, hereditary, another rat strain which had tendency for Alzheimer's, heredity, and so on, creating strains of the race of rats. If you think about it, for that particular strain of rats, at least in their collective, there is an evolution taking place through that form in a particular line, and in another subgroup of those rats, a different form of evolution, and each following its own way. The individual doesn't matter. It's the group and the quality of genes of the group that is growing. So he says, the individual would be a quickly perishing instrument. And that's why they do it with rats. I mean, they die quickly and then you have children quickly. If you can somehow shorten the life further, you can go through multiple generations quickly and breed a highly specialized strain. But if you see for the inhabiting consciousness of the divine, which is inhabiting all these, it does not have sufficient base to latch on to an individual to be able to build something worthwhile. By the time it can build something worthwhile, the individual perishes. And so its primary growth is the collective formulation. So a more abiding collective formulation is the race. And in the race, you find the real step of progressive manifestation of the cosmic inhabitant, the divine living within. When you look at the earth in this way, the whole of the earth, and all the variety of human cultural and psychological types, you get a glimpse of something interesting. It's as if there is an inhabitant presence trying to develop on earth many specialized human types. And in the racial evolution, there is something which is being created, a specialization of possibilities. And then, especially you see the last 2000 years, this is obvious. And then recently, in the 1960s, the mother says, nature has decided now, having made many specialized types, to bring it all together and mix everything. And she said the logic of it is, it will create a sudden outburst of a rich variety of types. And the strategy nature uses is to create an extreme of one type, an extreme in the opposite direction of another type, and so on, going into extremes of specialization where you can do it much more quickly. And then mix them to create all the intermediate variations. If from the beginning the attempt was to create a rich diversity, the moment you develop one specialization, it would damage another side of development. Because still, in relative terms, the human lifespan is somewhat short. How much time do you really have to develop yourself? The first 20 years you spend in basically growing up. Another a decade or so into coming into your own to build sufficient independence and self-confidence, and then you have at best about 20 years of real activity as an individual, after which your biology quickly begins to degrade and your flexibility begins to drop, and then quickly the degeneration reaches a point where you can't do much. If you look at all these areas where the full engagement of the human capacity is required, they will hire people from age 25 to about 40, and after that it begins to drop off. Whether in the military, if you are in a commando training, well, you can only be a commando who can do almost anything that you're trained to do, or even exceed your training in that narrow band of 15 or 20 years. That's about it. After that, already the decline begins. So if you look at the Earth's evolution, if you really want to create a rich diversity, there is not enough time in the human life. So the only way nature can do is to create these concentrated types. which develop into a specialization. Here, the aspect of sensitivity is developed. There, the aspect of strength is developed. Somewhere else, the body's resilience to illness. Somewhere else, its flexibility and adaptability. I have 4 completely different directions. And then nature says, now that I've taken it to the maximum that I wanted, mix them. And suddenly there's a rich variety, and if you mix all 4 within a couple of generations, you've created a body that can house a consciousness which is extremely flexible, adaptable, resilient to illnesses, at the same time sensitive and strong and intelligent and compassionate and all those things. Now, it may seem strange to even ascribe psychological qualities to a person because we still think of it in terms of the soul bringing it. But if you study animals and the way human beings breed animals, you can see how within a few generations, dogs, horses can be bred for very distinct psychological characteristics. Dogs which are more intelligent as a breed, dogs which are more compassionate as a breed, dogs which are specialized just to look after sheep and keep them together. Now that's a behavior which is so specialized but developed within a few generations. You take the dog at birth out of its environment, let it grow up in a completely independent environment, its instinct will still be looking for sheep to push around and gather. It's amazing how much you can actually bring into the physical type. And this, remember, is the housing that the soul is going to use, into which it will bring its own influences and priorities. But nature has created this, and now in the 1960s this began. It began then, today you see it much more grown. Today it's not unusual even for somebody whose heredity or family is in one location, who is born in a completely different environment, has an education in a different culture, moves for a job or higher studies in a different environment, even a different country, marries across traditions and cultures and racial types, and it creates such a rich, complex mix that you find it difficult to identify a type. In the earlier days, you could look at a person and pretty much say, are you from such and such a place? You could listen to the accent and say, did you grow up in that city? Down to that precision. Or even sometimes, are you from South Delhi or North Delhi? Depending on your accent or a particular mannerism. But now it's difficult because of this mixture. But that's part of nature's strategy. But here the focus is on the race, the collective formulation, which is how the cosmic inhabitant universal spirit is growing through this evolution. On the other side, he says, rebirth is an indispensable condition for any long duration and evolution of the individual being in the earth existence. Because the individual is so short and the race is all that can develop, if you want individual evolution, you have to have rebirth. He uses this phrase, in earth existence. We can take earth to be generally matter, but also there is a suggestion that you could have this kind of more collective evolution in other spaces, other planets, even on the earth perhaps. You will recall the mother's observation that at that time, 100 years ago, when she went into China, she saw that the individualized psychic being was not there. It was much more the collective evolution which was stronger, because they were originally from the moon, she said. Afterwards there was a mixture and that was no more so relevant. But that suggestion that actually a group of human beings could grow without the necessity of an individualized psychic being the primary driver, and still the evolution grows on Earth. Why not entire planets? Why not entire galaxies where this kind of evolution is the theme? And if it can be, very likely it is, because you have the infinity of the universe to play around and experiment with. In fact, this is the case with many beings which grow up in other planets, and it's the kind of information that has been gathered through contact of human beings with beings visiting from other planets. Not all of them, but many of them seem to have a collective evolution of this kind, and they are fascinated by this individualization that is the character of the Earth evolution. And it's as if they want to participate in that, or they're trying to learn something from that. But in their evolution, this exaggerated individualization seems to be so strange that they even fear it. And instinctively, when a human being meets a being of that type who is part of the collective evolution, they feel, this is not a human, because they do not sense that individualization which is characteristic of the Earth. And you can feel, this person does not belong to the Earth. But the logic here is unavoidable, that if you want evolution of individual being, you have to have rebirths so as to be able to have a long duration of individual evolution. Each grade of cosmic manifestation, each type of form that can house the indwelling spirit, is turned by rebirths into a means for the individual soul, the psychic entity, to manifest more and more of its concealed consciousness. Each life becomes a step in a victory over matter by greater progression of consciousness. So the advantage of the individual evolution is that he describes grades of cosmic manifestation and types of form in each grade. The suggestion here is giving you a picture very complex. You have levels of consciousness. Obvious, more living, more conscious, and it's a vertical ascension. But within each level you have multiple types. The zebra and the horse, you may say even in appearance have similarity of structure, may have even broadly, let's say, similar level of consciousness, but the type being housed is fundamentally different. Maybe if you look at the natural affinity of certain animals, you may recognize that perhaps even they represent in a completely different form a similarity of grade of consciousness. Otherwise, they would not understand each other. In the discussion on Friday, I gave the example of the sea anemone and the clownfish, which is immune to its poison, being in a symbiosis. Now, in a symbiosis, if one is thinking, feeling, acting by a certain grade of values and another by a completely different grade, if there was not something common between them, you could not have any kind of meaningful communication. So there has to be something common. Maybe the common thing is an overlap of consciousness of some part, which is the bridge between them. Or it may even be in more complex forms of symbiosis, where they are of the same grade of consciousness, but completely different priorities or types or focus of type. You'll see this among human beings. Often one form, one type of human being, highly developed in aspect of knowledge but weak in strength. Another highly developed in strength but weak in knowledge. And if the two work together, they make for a complementary which is more complete. But they must have some kind of shared value or shared ideal, otherwise you cannot work together. But their differences of specialization become complementary if they are of a reasonably common grade of ideal or objective, or even grade of consciousness in which they live. And then it's as if they join to support each other in a semi-symbiotic relationship. So he is describing, looking at the big picture of the tree of life on earth. Levels emerging, and on each level specialized forms. What is the meaning of those specialized forms he will be discussing later. But just to bring that suggestion, each represents a particular quality of consciousness more developed. So if in the gazelle in the plains, the movement of consciousness is this very beautiful leap harmonious movement of its play. In the same plane, the horse is expressive more of the aspect of power, strength, pure surging energy moving forward. The difference of quality of what they represent is in terms of consciousness and power of consciousness that is highlighted. Out of any form, nature could pull out any. If somehow the deer was eliminated, made extinct because of human stupidity, then out of the horse, nature could breed a specialization of horse which has now developed the aspect of the gazelle. And very quickly, it would separate, peel off until even there would be a difference in form, perhaps in color. And the specialization settled, it would then stay as another species. You would not call it horse anymore because what it would express is so different. And so nature is deliberately as if peeling off focal types of powers of consciousness. Each grade of cosmic manifestation, each type of form that can house the indwelling spirit is turned by rebirth into a means for the individual soul, the psychic entity, to manifest more and more of its concealed consciousness. As the psychic individual entity enters this, it works to expand and increase what it can manifest, but in the process it pushes the capacity of that form a little further. Each life becomes a step in a victory over matter by a greater progression of consciousness in it, which shall make eventually matter itself a means for the full manifestation of the spirit. Now what he is showing you here is the driving engine. Once you have the individual evolution entering, the driving engine is as if the individual pushing, and each time increasing the grade of consciousness until eventually matter itself becomes a means for full manifestation of the spirit. You're literally dragging matter and compelling matter to evolve against all the resistance which we saw earlier. Now imagine this as a slow, gradual process, taking whatever number of millions or billions of years on a planet. It reaches a degree where now the human consciousness of intellect has come into its own, sufficient that it now begins to experiment with and tamper with atoms, genetics. If it does not act wisely, a few atomic explosions would destroy all life. A few foolish genetic interventions similarly could destroy all life. There is what is called horizontal transfer of genetics, where between two different species, close enough, the genes can get transferred. As I said, through eating of the apple or meat, or even, as in plants, through the mix of the pollen, certain elements can get transferred. And we have recently, barely 10 years ago, released into nature a particular programming in the gene by which the seed commits suicide. When the seed is first planted, it grows and the plant gives new seed, but each of these seed has within it a genetics programming that it will make the seed fail and die. So you cannot take the seed and plant it again. You have to go back to the company to buy their seed. Except that this programming now is jumping from this seed into other seeds in the wild, in nature, causing a sudden decline of fertility in other species of plants, spreading horizontally. Suicide gene, impulse of life reversing upon itself to destroy itself. And if done in a certain way, it could very rapidly destroy all life on earth, which is already happening. Now, all of these are to show you that it's wonderful, this process, as long as it is driven by nature and the consciousness has not crossed the point where it has the power to seize upon the evolutionary process and tamper with it. But we are at that point, and not for the first time. We have done it before on this earth, as Sri Aurobindo refers to the racial memory of Atlantis, Lemuria, and perhaps other cycles before that we do not have memory of. It has happened on other planets across our galaxy, across the universe. And it's always the most dangerous transition point. But if allowed to continue in this transition, the outcome will be matter itself would be conquered by spirit in a series of progressions. Yes. So the question is whether animals can have also that psychic individuality. And you will see this most obviously in certain dogs, cats, especially animals which have very close contact with human beings. Sometimes that aspect gets highlighted to such an extraordinary degree that you can see this animal is even thinking or trying to think, but somehow the body blocks it, the biology prevents it. And if it could just jump into a human body, it would be a completely normal human child. You see them evolve to such a degree. But the passage is like this. In the lowest grades of animal forms, the individuality is not so strong. The collective group identity is stronger. Or an individual represents the group identity, while others have a semi-formed individuality, vague, unindividualized. So you have the pack leader who is dominant, and others almost automatically with them. In fish, you call it a school of fish, you do not even see a pack leader. They are all equally blurred. Rather, there you see distinctly one individual housing itself in so many bodies. And so they all turn at the same time, zoop, 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 because the one individual living in them chooses to move in the same way. With many birds you will see, they leap off all together flying, and then they fly together in formation, because it's the group consciousness which is the primary unit. In the bees and the ants, you see the center of that group consciousness individualized in the queen bee or queen ant. And it's as if you take out the queen bee, the whole nest breaks down, and they go and join other nests, or they just lose their way and wander. Or if they survive long enough, a new queen bee emerges and becomes the unit. So what you recognize is there is an individual housing these multiple bodies, but with a special focus in its body. Remove that, and if it has enough time, it creates a new body, or it is gone and this group body disperses and joins some other group body. But from there, you have more evolved animals where, although part of a pack, the individualities now begin to assert themselves and develop. As they move through form where individuality is more possible, you need for that a vehicle, a body where individuality is not so bound in the pack identity. They will get into higher grades of animal where their individuality can assert themselves. You will see this, for example, at the level of horses, where they have a group, they stay in families, but each has a distinct individuality even in the wild, and can break away, can wander, live alone for a while, come back to the pack, go back to live alone. And that's when the individuality is beginning to assert itself over the group identity. So the early phase of the levels of consciousness, the group asserts over individual. Eventually the two come at equal importance, and then eventually the individual begins to exceed the group. Now in the human being, you will see also the group is very strong. Family units are strong, community units are strong, etc. Sometimes even other tribal identities can be extremely strong. But the individuality here has the capacity to break away. It may or may not. When the soul is sufficiently individualized, the psychic being is more evolved in its individuality, it may grow up in a unit like this, which is still very much interdependent in the human bonding, but it will feel itself suffocating. It may need to distance itself. There will be a loosening of the group bond, at least around this individual. It may still be part of it, but if the group does not allow it its own space, it will want to separate or distance. And we see a lot of that happening today. But the point is, the individuality takes time to come into its own and then outgrow, and then it can maintain a balance of the group and even create complex group structures without losing individuality. The ideal development of the individuality is when this individual is so complete in itself that it is able to bond with any group identity as necessary without losing its individuality, and so participate in a complex collective life. Taking for example, coming home, I am part of my family. Going to work, I am part of my work group where I am like a family. Mixing with my friends, I am part of a different bonding structure. And all of these as if overlap, but none of them prevents me from being myself. I can equally walk away from all of them and be complete and happy as a unit, as well as engage fully with them. Wherever you see a dependence and an inability to assert your own uniqueness, your identity, you'll find that aspect or that part of the development is a little weak in the individuality. So, coming back to your question, yes, in the animal also, although starting with a pack structure in the lower levels, the individuality can emerge out of the pack and move then into bodies in which the individual growth now is more nourished, more easily available, until it comes into some level where it can even live completely as an individual, or even transition to the human with a developed individuality or a semi-developed individuality.
And this could happen only here, not after the rebirth.
Through rebirth, it can switch levels of forms and types of animals.
Individualize the animals here.
Yes.
First, not after in between.
Not in the subtle worlds. Yes. So the development of individuality can continue in the subtle body. Some kind of growth can continue in the subtle world, but it will not help in the evolution of matter. It will not help in the evolution of the species. When you take a body, you will still enter a body which is what it was before. Entering it, when you grow in individuality, you are pushing matter and matter's evolution. And this is what he is highlighting here. The driver of the material evolution, the driver of spirit's conquest over matter, is this individual inside matter pushing and extending the consciousness of the vehicle that is housing it, and making the vehicle itself more capable as it moves. So we have a very complex picture. Individuality is not necessarily fully developed in the human being either. Nor can we say that in animals it is not developed. Sometimes an animal can be more individualized than a human. And so we have a very complex free structure. The difference will be in human it can express a more developed consciousness of mind, and particularly self-aware, conscious buddhi, intellect, which it cannot on lower levels, which have not yet developed it. But if, for some reason, by human stupidity, we have a nuclear war, humanity perishes, nature could still take other animals which have survived, the dolphin in the ocean, which is very close to human mentality, and rapidly accelerate the emergence of self-aware conscious mind, and make it the next focus through which to continue that evolution which was cut off. When you think in these terms, you realize, in fact, nature takes all these different forms of animals. Through each, she is moving towards mentality, only to the extent that she wants. Now, on Earth, because the primary emergence of mentality was through the passage of the ape form, she has held back the dolphin, held back the elephant, held back the dog, to be pretty much where it is, and maybe a little bit enhanced from contact with human beings, but not pushed too much the biological capacity to stand up and think and become self-aware. But at any moment she could. And if she could do it on Earth, she can do it on other planets. So there can be, if you look at the big picture of evolution across galaxies, certain planets where the evolution of thinking form has been through the dog, others where it has been through the dolphin-like form, others through which it has been as on Earth through the ape form. And what you will see as they come into conscious mentality, they all turn into this star-shaped prototype, 2 legs, 2 arms, 1 head, torso, but variations. thinner, fatter, skin types may be different, blood types and variations may be even different colors, transparency may be different, particularities of ears, eyes, and other details may be completely different. So if you've emerged through the dog evolution, then there'll be a dog-like snout, but the vocalization would be fully developed as in the human being. And so it will look like, oh, here's a talking, walking dog, but very conscious. And so when you meet beings from other lines of evolutionary development, at first you're surprised, but you see their resemblance with earth types. Because it's a similar model, similar pattern everywhere on all the planets. In each case though, what you see here, the point Aurobindo makes, each life becomes a step in a victory over matter by greater progression of consciousness. And if this is the case, in it which shall make eventually matter itself a means for the full manifestation of the spirit. The challenge is for nature now to be able to form matter to make it capable of this. So think of it this way. In the first emergence of human body, nature is continuing to tweak the genetic structure, tweak and boost the grade of material substance and the machinery by which it can gather and organize that substance with the past evolution. At each thing emerging, it has to make sure it integrates. So it has taken a particular form by creating material of the brain, nervous cells, in which the consciousness is most able to express itself, in which the brain tissue is responsive to thought and is able to interface with a grade of consciousness which is non-physical. And so your mind can as if plug into a bundle of neural cells and feel and order and will itself to act through them. Neural cells are able to open themselves to a grade of influence which is of the type of mind and receive an impression and allow themselves to be molded by that impression in their activity. The bone, on the contrary, does not or cannot hold that kind of contact. And you have all kinds of grades of matter in between. Nature is actually refining matter and building higher grades of materiality and complexity of life form which can express the higher powers of consciousness. If the mind now wants to express intuition, the very fact that it begins to organize intuition will make a change eventually in the brain structure, creating a center through which the intuitive consciousness could directly engage with the brain. If intuition is not included, then that center would not have developed. Just as the intellect and power of intellect, the ability to discriminate between good and bad, right and wrong, involved the development of the frontal lobe, which is not there in all animals, which became its representative of that grade of consciousness. So intuition developing will create a further refinement even eventually in the brain structure. First in the working, but when the working organizes itself to become encased in matter, it develops its own structure, but now fully integrated with all past levels. So it is spirit eventually which is pushing through individual evolution to develop a base in matter for the full manifestation of spirit. But this is the picture he has created. But this account of the process and meaning of the terrestrial creation is at every point exposed to challenge in the mind of man itself. Because the evolution is still halfway on its journey, is still in the ignorance, is still seeking in the mind of a half-evolved humanity for its own purpose and significance. So because our evolution is halfway through, our mind is still partly ignorant, we can look at this big picture and question. And we can say, but what if? Can it not be different? What would that different thing be? And he's going to now explore that. It is possible to challenge the theory of evolution on the ground that it is insufficiently founded and that it is superfluous as an explanation of the process of terrestrial existence. Do you really need evolution for this growth of consciousness? It is open to doubt, even if evolution is granted, whether man has the capacity to develop into a higher evolutionary being. Can it even happen? Have we not reached the limit? Maybe the rest is not possible. It is open also to doubt whether the evolution is likely to go any farther than it has gone already, or whether a supramental evolution, the appearance of a consummated truth consciousness, a being of knowledge, is at all probable in the fundamental ignorance of the earthly nature. So here you can say, look, matter itself is so deeply bound in ignorance. This idea of a supramental being emerging, it's just a dream. One can question. He will address all of these things as we go along, but first he raises all these questions because the questions exist. Not only in the materialistic scientist, but even in the spiritual traditions. The concept that there can be a higher grade of consciousness than mind, or even that self could take up matter and make it plastic directly, is considered to be, in many traditions, not only impossible but foolish. Because the accepted norm is that we have come to the highest possible, the best that our mentality can do is reflect some light of the self, and after that abandon and move out into self. And we have seen in our other studies in the synthesis of yoga that this can be a very seductive experience. It feels so vividly real to be in self and the world to be unreal that it seems foolish even to think of these things, or uninteresting. What does it matter? I have that. So Sri Aurobindo makes this very interesting observation that even now, then that was in the 1940s, 30s, but I'm sure even now, there are yogis in the Himalayas who are watching this experiment of divinization of consciousness and supramental manifestation with a curiosity. And they're saying, oh, what is this interesting thing he's trying to do? Oh, let's see if it works out. Interesting, but that's about all. Because it just doesn't matter, or they're convinced it's not even possible. And that's why Sri Aurobindo has to deal with the question. Another construction, neither teleological nor evolutionary, can be put on the workings of the spirit in the manifestation here. We could look at the whole thing differently and not have this need for evolution to be there. And it may be as well, before proceeding further, to formulate succinctly the line of thinking which makes such a construction possible. So, before moving on, Sri Aurobindo is going to discuss this. Is it possible even to knock out completely this whole idea of evolution, the need for consciousness to drive, to have forms to inhabit and to develop and so on? Can we not just have life just like that, without needing evolution even? And so he addresses this, and we'll touch upon this quickly and elaborate upon it next time, in the next paragraph. Admitting that the creation is a manifestation of the timeless eternal in a time eternity, admitting that there are 7 grades of consciousness, and that material inconscience has been laid down as a basis for the reascent of the spirit, admitting that rebirth is a fact, a part of the terrestrial order, still a spiritual evolution of the individual being is not an inevitable consequence of any of these admissions, or even of all of them together. Now notice, this is a lawyer arguing in the court, because all these admissions he has gone through in the earlier chapters, where the logic of it has been so compelling you cannot question it. Okay, so we accept that it is something timeless that is manifesting in time and in an eternity. We accept there are 7 levels, planes of consciousness, and so there is always the influence between them. We accept that this inconscience of matter is meant to be a basis for the emergence of spirit and its growth. we accept even rebirth. But after that, still a spiritual evolution of the individual being is not an inevitable consequence. So how can it be? What's the way to do it? And he says, it is possible to take another view of the spiritual significance and the inner process of terrestrial existence. If each thing created is a form of the manifest divine existence, each is divine in itself by the spiritual presence within it, whatever its appearance, its figure, or character in nature. If you accept that all levels, all types of creatures, they have some essential divinity in them, then, he says, in each form of manifestation, the divine takes the delight of existence, and there is no need of change or progress within it. Now notice what happens. You have thrown out completely the need for an individual evolution. In the cosmos, you have now a series of levels and types of forms. Each is expressive of some aspect or of divine consciousness. In each, the divine consciousness is fully enjoying itself. Why do you need evolution? All the levels of consciousness are represented. All the powers of consciousness have their own species, and they're all there. It's static. You don't need evolution, right? If some part is missing, well, introduce it. We still don't need evolution. If there's a higher possibility, well, let that pop out also from the divine manifestation. Now you've represented it. No evolution required. And when he places it like that, you say, oh yeah, we didn't think about it. And it makes a lot of sense. Whatever ordered display or hierarchy of actualized possibilities is necessitated by the nature of the infinite being is sufficiently provided for by the numberless variation. The teeming multitude of forms, types of consciousness, natures that we see everywhere around us. So whenever the divine wants to manifest from his infinite being any possibility of any kind of experience, well, you have enough variety of types, levels of consciousness. Within those you have variations of each individual. And so whatever the divine wants to experience or express of experience in the universe, you have enough bodies and typal variations to express that. So within a given type, one human being can become the perfect artist, another perfect scientist, another perfect musician, and you have the freedom to play it all out. You still don't need evolution. There is no teleological purpose in creation, and there cannot be, for all is there in the infinite. In that infinite consciousness, all these possibilities are already there. You do not need them to come out in a sequence. The divine has nothing that he needs to gain or that he has not. So even creation is not required. You could just be in the divine experience of all these different aspects of experience. Or, if there is creation and manifestation, it is for the delight of the creation of manifestation, not for any other purpose. So what you see here, even the creation would not be needed if in the divine all these possibilities are experienced. He is complete. Or he creates, takes them all into form for the delight. There is then no reason for an evolutionary movement with a culmination to be reached, or an aim to be worked out and effectuated, or a drive towards some ultimate perfection. Now this one sentence is extremely important, and we will review it next time. The different aspects of the thing which evolution is fulfilling, or the means of evolution. Reason for evolutionary movement with a culmination to be reached. That is one thing. Aim to be worked out and effectuated, made effective, or drive towards some ultimate perfection. These are broadly 3 different categories which would justify a push for something. But none of these are needed in this picture which we had of a perfectly expressed range of types. In fact, we see that the principles of creation are permanent and unchanging. Each type of being remains itself and does not try or has any need to become other than itself. A dog does not say, I want to become horse. Horse does not say, I want to become human. They look at humans curiously and say, what a weird fellow. I'm happy to be horse. So the truth of this picture which he has given is already there in some way. And what is the solution he offers? Is evolution a necessity when we see all the types are already there in a rich variety? And so this is what we will take up next time in our discussion. And for the moment, what he has laid out before us is a deep insight into the compulsion in evolution to create and express all these levels and types, if you accept evolution. But now we are questioning whether evolution itself is necessary. And briefly, if this picture he gives is possible, then it must be available somewhere. If not in the material world, it should be available in the subtle worlds. If you go, in fact, in the vital worlds, this is what you see. If you go into mental worlds, this is what you see. There's a range of types of creatures, beings, of all kinds of powers and aspects, even variations of forms. And they're all there, they're all happy as they are. There is no compulsion in them to emerge out of form. Within that form, they have all the growth that they want. And that's why Sri Aurobindo says they are all typal worlds. If they want to evolve and experience evolution out of form to something greater, they have to enter the physical world, because here is where you have this possibility of evolution. And so this relationship and this picture, and with the need for evolution, we will elaborate and see the full insight of it next time. Now, the next session we will have will be Sunday after next. I'll be out on the 10th and we will continue this on the 17th. And for those who are interested, we will show a video of some other talks to keep the mood of the study. But we pause at a very interesting, delicate and crucial question. The picture, though, which he has laid is extremely important, because here we have gone to the very core, the very heart of the evolutionary drive, not just for Earth, but in the whole universe. And it is something worth dwelling upon, that each one of us, without exception, has been through this entire journey across all the levels of consciousness from wherever we began, across numerous forms in each of those levels, experiencing the collective growth, experiencing individual awakening, and through whatever long struggle, our individualized consciousness and the psychic being has come into where we are today. And from where we are today, something deep within yearns for, longs for that next step of evolution, that transition of the passage from evolution in ignorance to a greater evolution in the knowledge, into a next product of evolution of the supramental supermanhood, or the spiritual supermanhood, which is the call that nature feels. Mother explains how right now is the time when nature has felt the call, and if nature feels the call, immediately it resonates in all her creatures. And in those of her creatures which are more conscious, she begins to actualize that call. And therefore, everywhere on earth, if you go back to a time about 130 years ago, 1990 about, everywhere in the higher mind of humanity, there was this idea of what can be the next step of evolution? What is the future humanity? And even the word Superman, which Nietzsche formulated as an exaggeration of the human type, was an attempt to conceive of what will happen next. There's even a book which appeared at that time, The Coming Next Race, or something like that, which conceived of human beings with extraordinary occult powers, with the mind they can shape matter and do things. But none of them could conceive of a spiritual consciousness which lives by a fundamentally non-ego state in a cosmic consciousness, individualized, with a completely different value system and priority. And that needed, of course, the spiritual formulation that Sri Aurobindo brought. And with this, our mind can say, yes, this is worthwhile. if it is possible. But yes, this is worthwhile, and somewhere deep within us we know not only it is possible, but it shall be. It is inevitable. And so this we hold on to as we meditate for a few minutes on this theme.